Hello, thanks for joining me. So, I want to talk about a very relevant issue to what I'm doing right now, which is using the medium of a social networking site, in this case, YouTube. Um, what I'm going to be discussing is probably more relevant to Facebook, actually, and other interactive social networking sites. With YouTube, it's interactive, but it's about making videos, pontificating opinions, sharing ideas, and so forth and so on. Facebook, slightly different context, but I suppose a similar principle. Now, what I want to focus on is the difference between how we communicate online and how we communicate in the real world. I've no doubt that I've touched on this subject before, but I do believe it's very interesting and very relevant. Still struggling with the mouthful, so I'm going to try not to talk too fast in this video. Um, I personally have an experience with this insofar as I make these videos and I share my thoughts and my ideas, and sometimes I vent. Sometimes I vent when I feel strongly about something. But the things I talk about in these videos are not necessarily the same things I would talk to someone about in, say, a coffee shop or a pub. Believe it or not, I don't actually like arguments. I don't like confrontation. And although I'm a pretty political person, I don't actually go up to strangers and start political debates with them. It tends to be in the areas of politics, sociology, and religion that people tend to be sensitive. People tend to be wary of what others think. I think only a very, very small handful of people have absolutely a total loss of inhibitions, whereby they really don't care what they say to anybody. I think the majority of people think first before they speak. They think about the person they're talking to and they think about the context in which you're talking. I mean, you could be walking down the street and you've got no idea what the people walking past you, what their ideology is. And in polite society, it's deemed to be rude to go up to someone and to impose your views on them. And I believe it is. I mean, it's not something I would do, and I wouldn't appreciate other people doing it with me. And there's a slight irony about this because as a society, we are also put a lot of focus on freedom of expression and transparency. And yet, there is a reluctance, understandably, to be too forward in their own views. There's certain people have to be. Politicians, for example, they have to opinionate. They have to tell people what they think. Otherwise, people won't know what they stand for. And I think one of the hardest things about politics is, well, I guess it's not hard for those who do it because they've conditioned themselves into that sort of world. Um, there are other professions, I guess, in legal work, perhaps in business, where people argue politics, argue sociology. Sports people argue, but that's more about ratings and how good a particular player or a fighter or whatever is. Um, so politicians, political activists have to pontificate their views because people need to know what they believe in. So when we hear Nigel Farage or Jeremy Corbyn or Nicola Sturgeon or whoever it is, they're giving their opinion and whatever it is they're giving their opinion on. That's fine. People need to know. Now they might flip flop. They might not always be truthful, but they're used to it. People who are not politicians or not lawyers or not business people wouldn't necessarily be used to pontificating the views. And I think it all comes down to the time and the place. Now, sometimes I wonder, is it hypocritical to be very vocal online, but not so vocal in the real world? A while back, I would have thought you should be absolutely consistent. So what you say online, you should say in the real world. I'm not so sure it's that simple. I've given this a bit of thought. I'm very opinionated in these videos. I say what's on my mind. People watch my videos, they either agree or disagree. I'm active in a number of forums, debate forums. Again, people voice their views, they either agree or disagree. People are challenged, people counter challenge. I've been challenged, I've agreed with others. I've been thumbed up, I've been thumbed down. We've all been there. Anyone who's active online has been there. But I find that people are reluctant to talk about taboo subjects in public. And it's understandable because I think online there is a barrier. If you get tired of it, you can just leave the conversation. In the real world, it's not quite so simple. Perhaps you could change the subject, perhaps you can make excuses and leave. But when you're directly facing someone, for one thing, I think people do. How can I put it? I think online people are a bit more blunt than they would be in the real world. You know, there's people on the hard right and the hard left I dislike, and I dislike their politics. But I wouldn't necessarily go up to someone on, say, the hard left and say, "Oh, you're a flipping social justice warrior." I wouldn't necessarily go up to someone in the hard right and say, "Oh, I don't like your views on welfare," whatever it is. Why? Why would I do that? Why would I create a confrontation? And that's really what I'm driving at. Is it cowardice to avoid confrontation? I don't think it is, actually. You know, there's this concept in the Western world that we always have to confront, we always have to challenge, we always have to, make our points. How about having a view and voicing your view, but not putting it on others? And I think one thing about online is that you're not imposing it on others. So, for example, I'm opinionated in these videos, but people can choose whether they watch my videos or not. Now, it would be a different matter if I, for example, uploaded a video and put my video on a forum of, I don't know, people I disagreed with, because that would be sort of like me imposing it on them in the real world. And to be clear here, I'm not saying that debate is a bad thing. I mean, it's an ancient aspect inherently tied in with democracy. You know, universities have debating societies, which incidentally are now becoming an issue in themselves because of the whole culture of safe spaces and all that sort of thing. I don't think debate is a bad thing, but I also believe that those who enjoy debate need to understand that not everyone does. And I don't think it is necessarily being a coward or surrendering your principles just because you want to close up back and forth. I don't think there's anything wrong with saying, look, let's agree to disagree. Because I may find someone who I find quite likable on a personal basis, but I don't particularly like their politics. And you get examples of couples, even. Um, the wife may be left wing, the husband may be right wing, or vice versa. And I think the reason they tend to work out is because they either avoid politics altogether or they have found a way to conduct their conversations in a civil manner. There's many, many examples of people who are in intimate relationships, and not necessarily romantic, it can also be friendships, with people they wouldn't necessarily agree with. Because the thing is, we cannot go through life in a bubble. We cannot only, it is absolutely inevitable that we will go through life meeting people who have ideologies we really disagree with, but we cannot be in a situation where we always think, oh, I cannot talk to that person, or I cannot communicate with them. Well, number one, sometimes we have to. It might be a work colleague. It might be someone that we may have to do business with for one reason or another, but we can't kind of say, I'm not going to speak to that person because I don't like their politics. Because I think if you took that mentality, although it's very tempting sometimes, it's impossible. If you only associated with people that you absolutely agreed with, you'd end up with a very, very, very narrow circle of people. Because even within left wing circles and within right wing circles, it's very rare that you will get people who are absolute clones of one another. So you may get, for example, this is an absolute example. It's not, I'm not saying it's a standard. It's just an example. You could have a communist guy who doesn't necessarily like feminism, but he is a hardcore supporter of workers' rights. You could have, I don't know, a right wing woman who has very strong views against abortion, but she may dislike misogynistic comments from male politicians. These are just very loose examples. The point I'm making is even within the left right spectrum, there will be disagreements. So I think we have to get around this idea that we always, always have to defend ourselves and put forward our views in the real world. I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing that mediums like YouTube can be used for voicing our views. I don't think it should be a case that you're inconsistent. So I would never ever support a situation whereby someone was really vocal online and then they were just an outright hypocrite in the real world. So let's say, for example, again, just a random example, let's say they had very strong views about gay people online, but then they met gay people in the real world and put on a completely friendly front and said, "Oh, I like you," and that would be fake. That would be totally fake. Probably what's more likely is they would just not say anything or just avoid the conversation. Um, but I think that's realistic. I think most people, if they're being absolutely honest, do not communicate in the real world as they would communicate online. I'm not necessarily talking about the wording, but I'm talking about the scenario of confrontation. In other words, you see a news report on Facebook, let's say from whatever source, BBC, Yahoo News, Al Jazeera, whatever it is, you'll see loads of people voicing their opinion on that. I do it all the time, and so does a lot of people. Now, in the real world, if you're in a coffee shop and you overhear a conversation, let's say two people discussing, let's say, Brexit, you wouldn't necessarily interrupt the conversation. Why? Because it would be rude. They would think, oh, why are you butting in on our personal conversation? Even though it's not necessarily personal, it's an external geopolitical, social political issue. The logic would be, oh, it's their conversation, I'm not getting involved. And yet online, we think, oh, I will get involved because I'm a member of the public. This is a topical issue. I'll have my say. So what I'm driving at is there is unquestionably a different context online from the real world. I don't think people should be fake, but I don't think there's anything wrong with being opinionated online in a responsible way. I'm not saying like, be a hate monger and shitster online. But being opinionated, I think, is okay if it's done in a responsible way, and then you don't necessarily pontificate those views in the real world. I mean, I'm not going to go, I might be reading a newspaper in a coffee shop. I might find a report that really pisses me off for one reason or another. I'm not going to stand up in the middle of a coffee shop and say, oh, by the way, everyone, this is what I think of this. No. What I might do is come home and think that's a subject that's worth talking about in a YouTube video. So I think this is a very interesting phenomenon, and I think that probably most people can relate to it. Like I say, there are some people who have no choice. If you're a politician, you have to make your views public. But even I suspect politicians wouldn't necessarily get into every single conversation about politics, believe it or not. So when they meet members of the public, they wouldn't necessarily say, um, "This is my opinion about vote Leave or vote Remain. What do you think?" More often than not, they make small talk because, in the end of the day, they come from the public. Most politicians, believe it or not, do have another life. Okay, I know you get career politicians But you do get a lot of politicians, more than people think actually, who have come from other worlds and they have other interests, just like any profession. A politician may be obviously interested in the daily affairs of politics and their constituency work, but you know what? They might be a supporter of a local football club. They might watch the football when they have free time. So, and I think actually they should, because I don't think it would be healthy if they were thinking about politics 24/7. Then they'd be like a robot. I think the public expect people to have another life as well. I think that's totally healthy. But yeah, I'll round it up there. Basically, all I'm saying is people need to be aware that in the real world, you can't just impose your views on others, because people are not going to thank you for being really sort of, I believe in this and I believe in that, because all it's going to do is make people uncomfortable. Now, there's certain situations that say there's a protest going on and you deliberately confront one of the protesters, or they deliberately, well, they shouldn't confront people who are just getting on with their business. But if someone confronts them, okay, there's going to be a debate because it's the nature of what is going on. But protesters shouldn't kind of impose their protests onto others. Have the protests, wave the placards, shout the slogans, don't vandalize anything. Make your point that way, but I really, really would say to anybody, whether you're left wing or right wing or whatever, just be wary that when you're voicing your views in public, do it in a responsible way, because nobody is going to thank you for being really opinionated. Because what you're doing there is assuming that the person is going to be okay with what you're saying, or assuming that if they're not okay with it, oh well, you don't care anyway, and that's a little bit obnoxious. So I have some very strong views on a wide range of issues, but again, even when it comes to nationality issues, I'll cite yet another example. I detest Saudi Arabia's human rights record. I detest Saudi Arabia's attitude to atheists. I consider it one of the very worst examples of a theocracy. Now, if I meet a Saudi national, am I going to say to that guy, because it is mostly guys who are abroad, oh, by the way, your country has barbaric human rights abuses? No, because I don't know what his individual opinions are. Even though there's a reasonable likelihood that he'll be of a conservative persuasion, what gives me a right to opine on someone I don't even know when you might well be wrong about that person? Sometimes debates develop, and in that case, it's down to people to be responsible. And sometimes debates get heated. It happens. I'm not saying it's necessarily a bad thing, but I think most people, given a choice, would rather avoid it. Let me know your thoughts, and thanks for watching.